so we can start if you're ready.
Okay, so just a moment. So you'll introduce me when I say I'm ready to go. I'll give my 20-minute talk, and then you've got some Q&A to follow.
Okay.
Yep, that sounds fine. So I'll just make sure I've got the PowerPoint. Oh, sharing the screen. If I just make sure I know the links for that. So it's a bit different. But okay, I see the share screen. So I'll share the screen after you've introduced me.
Yeah, I did you co-host. I hope you can share.
Yeah, I can see the button. It looks like it's active. Okay, ready to go.
Well, thank you for accepting our invitation, Doctor. I will present myself and a little bit about you, then we go directly to topic. My name is Nevzat Çelik, and I am the president and the founder of the Paris Advanced Research Center. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you for the guest. And I hope someone are already also watching from YouTube. If you have difficulties to enter our Zoom panel, you can same time watch on YouTube. Today, our guest is from London, Professor Alistair Milne. He's a professor of financial economics and Loughborough University School of Business and Economics. He has also had a position at the Bank of England, the University of Surrey, London Business School, HM Treasury, and the National Statistic Office of Malawi. He's the author of The Wall of the House of Credit, has been published 2009 in Cambridge University, which is a comprehensive single-volume account of all different dimensions of the global financial crisis, and has been a regular media commentator on the crisis and the response by policymakers. He has been an annual research visitor at the Monetary Policy and the Research Department of the Bank of Finland. He has been a consultant to the House of Parliament, the Financial Service Authority, the European Commission, and several private sector institutions and trade bodies. I'm impressive. Professor Alistair, thank you for joining us again. I would like to start directly with our topic. Could you please explain us European unity and disunity in the energy crisis response since Russia invasion of Ukraine?
Thank you, Nesvat, for a very, very kind introduction. Let me share my screen. So you should now be seeing the title slide about European disunity.
Yes, I do see.
Okay, excellent. So I suppose one minor thing I should say, I was London-based for many years, but most recently, my most current position is actually at Loughborough University. It's a little difficult to pronounce, so and that's actually about 140 kilometers north of London, so it's in the Midlands of the UK. So yes, I want to give you my views about the current energy crisis. I have to say, I'm not an energy economist. I'm really more of a financial economist who specialized in risk management, regulation, and financial infrastructures. But I think it's the systemic crisis nature of these events that have drawn my attention. So there are some parallels, if not exact, with the crisis of 2007, 2008, but this time focused on energy markets rather than financial markets. And if I have an overall view on this, is that we often get lost in the details. It's important to have a simple, basic understanding of how the system as a whole works in order to think sensibly about how to respond. So that's kind of, I think, my justification as a risk management specialist to be talking about energy economics. I have found, though, that I've engaged since the dramatic rise of energy prices with colleagues in the UK, across Europe. I'd particularly mention the Bruegel Institute, who do very good work. And I think my views are similar to those that are held by most energy economists, but somehow not getting enough attention and discussion in the policy world. So we've had I think it's actually quite a problem in the UK. In our politics, there's been a great rejection of experts. we say we don't need to listen to experts. And I think that's led to a number of policy mistakes. That's not saying that experts should take the policy decisions, but policymakers need to, I think, take seriously and think carefully about the advice of those with particular sectoral expertise. So what I'll do for a few minutes is first give a kind of summary argument about this presentation. It's essentially a supply and demand analysis. And my key point, which I'll come back to at the end, is this needs response at a European, not a national level. And then to the extent I've got time, I'm going to fill in as many details as I possibly can. And if those who can access my PowerPoint, there are links to a couple of supporting papers. So the story so far, it's important to have a story, multiple factors, but most notably the threat of loss of Russian gas supplies has substantially raised European wholesale gas prices. So you can see in the chart, this is the standard European benchmark, the TTF forward, which is traded in Amsterdam. And what you'll see is that gas prices were rising substantially even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but then dramatically so since then. At one point, they were around 6 times the level they were before energy prices started rising, and they're still perhaps something like 3 to 4 times as high. I think eventually we're going to go back to the levels of prices close to those that we saw back in 2021, or before the autumn of 2021, because again, it's supply and demand. High prices creates incentives for demand to come, for supply to be increased. And as I'll talk in a moment, this is particularly about supply from around the world, the United States, Qatar, the Middle East, the Southeast Asia, that can be shipped to Europe to increase gas supply. But that cannot happen immediately on a sufficient scale. So that's something which is going to take 2, 3, maybe even 4 years to fully take place. But the crisis is now. So we can't rely on increased supply alone. They'll eventually come down, but in the meantime, we've got to think about how to manage the problem. I think the second key point I'd want to make, and this is perhaps at the heart of my presentation today, that this is a European, not a national problem. And I mean by that more than just that it's affecting many European countries. The key point here, which I don't think is sufficiently recognized in the media and the policy debates, is that we have limited infrastructure for transport of gas. You need when the gas, if you like I do, if you use gas for heating your home, that gas has to come on a pipeline, and that's a big investment to build that infrastructure to carry the gas to where it's going to be consumed. And I'll look at the detail shortly, but that means there's limitations on transport between different parts of Europe, but Northwest Europe, so that's the UK, Germany, France, of course, there's actually fairly good capacity for transporting gas. And it also means that the UK is not it also means that there's not enough import capacity. So as I said, over 3 to 4 years, the ultimate solution will be a market solution. It'll be one where there are very strong incentives for producers around the world to bring gas to Europe to replace lost Russian gas. But the infrastructure needs to be built. And it's what's the principal infrastructure are what are known as regasification facilities. So that the gas is transferred in a liquid form, and then it has to be regasified. And that's it. You had a question?
Yeah, sorry for disturbing. I mean, for the moment, there is another sources we can establish and bring it to Europe. I mean, it's when I see your presentation, it's very impressive. But though the UK is dependent only 4% of the gas from Russia, and other European countries like Germany, it's much more than other countries. but do they have structure, or how many years it takes to create another source?
So I think I'll come back to that later.
Okay.
My understanding is that the capacity to import worldwide as liquid natural gas will probably take 3-4 years to build up fully. There is some emergency work investment that's taking place now, but it will take time to take place fully. And pipelines take even longer to put together. But the other point which I like to make, particularly to a British audience for when I've been discussing these issues, is that yes, we have North Sea reserves, but those are dwindling. They don't produce as much as they did in the past. And although we only imported directly 4% of our gas from Russia, the fact that Europe is short of gas and we import our gas substantially from Europe, from Norway, means that we're not really much less exposed than, say, Germany is. Okay, so this is the simple framework. So this is the kind of lecturing I do to my undergraduate students. So I apologize if you've done a PhD in economics like myself, and this seems very obvious, but I think it's still important to spell out. So it's looking at supply and demand. So the initial situation is a standard supply and demand diagram, which determines the price. But the shocks have shifted the supply as follows. We can illustrate it. So supply from Russia has been reduced. Supply is always price sensitive, but still it's a very inelastic. In other words, you need a very big change in price to alter supply. And the same is true of demand as well. You need a big change in price to alter demand. So a relatively, I say relatively small, we're talking about a loss of 30% of European gas supplies in total, but you can see quite dramatic price effects driven by reduced supply. The current policy is to introduce a price cap, and I'll illustrate that in this next round. So that's what we're doing in the UK, that's what Germany's starting to do, and other countries saying, oh, we need to protect consumers and businesses. We'll allow the price to move from P1 to P prime here, but that's it. We're going to protect our consumers and businesses. And that's fine as far as it goes, but it then means you're interfering with the market mechanism. If you then have demand, if you do nothing else about demand, that means demand is not going to fall as much as it would without the price cap. And of course, in order to supply that demand, you're going to need a much higher wholesale price. So you'll end up with a difference between the price paid by the consumers and the businesses of P prime and the price that essentially the government is paying in order to support that price cap of P double prime. So potentially the costs are very large. Leaves the taxpayer to foot the bill. The alternative policy, which I don't think has got sufficient, it's got attention. It's had actually a lot of attention in Germany in particular, but very little attention here in the UK, is shifting the demand curve. So if we could shift the demand curve right back, we could achieve that price cap of P prime without cost to the taxpayer. So we could be, if we go far enough in reducing demand, and what I mean is managed demand reduction. So it could be programs of public education, it could be investments in insulation, it could be within the public sector, it could be very active programs to turn off lighting, to turn off heating when it's not really needed, to reduce thermostats. But it's something which is not working through the price mechanism, so it has to be a public campaign, and if necessary, with a degree of compulsion. Ultimately, it could be a rationing, but I think that's, I'll come back to that with the detail. That's the kind of extreme situation if we end up with a very cold winter, which will be pushing demand in the direction. Nesvet, you had another question.
Yeah, so in here, what I see, so there is, we need a policy to reduce the prices of the gas, exactly, or oil. And the second, we have to create and advocate policy to reduce the consume of the gas.
Exactly. It's a managed demand reduction rather than relying on the price mechanism. So as an economist, I just keep repeating the point. In the long run, the price mechanism is the right way to go. That will increase supply. But if dealing with a short-term crisis, then we have to think about government action alongside market mechanisms. So that's the broad picture. Let me just touch on a couple of other implications, and I've got some more slides with detail, but we'll decide as we go along how much of the detail we need to discuss. So obviously, there are major winners and losers. I mean, one of the striking features of this is that Norway, as the major supplier of natural gas to Europe, is a major winner financially. Norwegian exports will be sold at much higher prices than they otherwise were. In France, nuclear power producers will be major winners if they don't have fixed price contracts. I should say, by the way, you mentioned, Nesvet, oil prices. I think they're a bit separate because oil does not suffer from the same constraints on physical transport. Oil is obviously very important for transport, for diesel, for petrol, for cars, but the gas and electricity markets tend to be somewhat separate. So it's really gas and then electricity, because gas is used for generation electricity rather than oil.
And how about the coal?
Coal's an interesting one. I mean, obviously, longer term, it's essential that we take ourselves off coal in order to meet the requirements of net zero and climate change. But in the short term, we have to, regardless of our concerns about the climate, we have to seriously consider burning more coal rather than less for a year, at least this coming winter and possibly the winter after, in order to address the potential problems of shortage of gas. But I think the key point there is again, the more you do to manage demand, then the less you need to rely on coal to keep the lights on. Energy companies are at risk. Unfortunately, they're not hedged completely. Some are making substantial profits. Others are making substantial losses, especially those with contracts directly with Russia. And as I've said already, the government is, I think, appropriately protecting consumers and businesses, but with the consequence, the taxpayer footing the bill has a large fiscal exposure, which hasn't been properly addressed. So the policies, I think countries are doing a mixture of this, but I think not enough of shifting of the demand curve, this managed demand compression. But we can share the rents of low-cost producers. So in the UK, we're putting in a bit of a windfall tax on North Sea gas production. I think Norway, we can at least discuss with Norway. You're making all this money. What are you going to do with it? Would they reduce their prices, or perhaps more realistically, we can say, well, Norway, you have an obligation to assist substantially in the rebuilding of Ukraine after the Russian invasion has been defeated. But I'm emphasizing demand compression. So shifting that DD curve, not just relying on prices. And what I'll come on to in a moment is, this is most effective if it's done by all the major countries of Europe, particularly Northwest Europe. Other things, increased production. We've talked about fracking in the UK, more NLG imports, but that isn't going to make much difference this coming winter. Okay, so Nedra, I'm sort of alert to time, and I've already used about 15 minutes of we just probably about 5 minutes less. So maybe I should not try and do everything in these slides, but pick out a couple of the most important points, and then we could turn for another 5 to 10 minutes, and we can then turn to question and answer after that. I think that's probably the right way to go. So the rest of this presentation looks again at supply and demand, but in more detail, with the bottom line that demand management measures are needed to protect taxpayers and ensure that we have sufficient supply to avoid electricity blackouts. I think the particular point I'd add in relation to this slide is there is, of course, risk and uncertainty. We don't control the weather. As I like to joke, we think that God is on our side, not on Putin's side. But we don't know if the Almighty brings us a severe winter, especially a severe winter, which also is without much wind, then the problem will get worse, and we could end up with electricity blackouts. that's very much a possibility in the UK and in other countries. So it's not a prediction that will happen, but it's something that we need to be thinking about. How do we deal with that? So some background detail. Now, I've dug into a lot of available sources. The most comprehensive come from the International Energy Agency. They tend to be a bit out of date. So this has actually changed quite substantially in the subsequent 5 years because of the big shift to renewables. So wind and solar has increased substantially. But what their reports do show is that gives us a lot of detail about natural gas consumption in different EU states. And I think the most important point here is that the 5 largest account for over 75% of consumption. Particularly I think it's the largest 6 is over 75%, but particularly the largest 5, Germany, the UK, Italy, France, and the Netherlands. If we deal with the problem in these countries, we will have largely dealt with it altogether. The share of natural gas in energy supply varies. It's particularly high in the Netherlands, Italy, and the UK. Sweden, very little. The use varies country to country. The UK and the Netherlands, it's very much about domestic usage. We heat our homes using gas. Germany, it's commercial and public sector buildings and industry. In Italy, power generation. So it's the picture does vary from country to country, but it's still ultimately the same problem, a shortage of gas. Most countries, of course, rely on imports. The UK, it's about 50%. And we particularly rely on Norway and liquid natural gas. So this slide is about, well, what do we need to do to get demand back into supply, balance with supply? So something around 550 billion cubic meters, of which something around 140 come from Russia, and which will probably not disappear completely, but much of it is unlikely to resume over this winter. And we can meet that through a combination of greater imports. There's enough capacity to take in about another 40 billion cubic meters. Norway can produce a bit more. And then we're going to have to rely on consumption. And that can get us a long way. There are other few sources as well. We can nearly compensate, but a cold winter, as I said, could make a big difference and affects every country. It's not just Germany and Italy. I think I better not spend too much time on this slide, but it's making the point about the physical challenges of transferring gas around Europe. So this is actually produced by the UK Department of Energy, Business and Energy. But the blue arrows are pipelines, the green are the various facilities for moving, importing or exporting liquid natural gas. And I think the main lesson, I won't go through this in detail, but the main lesson is that this area, the sort of where I'm indicating most, the northwest of Europe is fairly closely connected, but others can be quite separate. Spain and Portugal are largely disconnected from the rest of Europe. The southwest of again is not closely connected. But in terms of the resisting the impact of Russia, provided we can sort out the problems in northwest Europe, then I think politically we will have ultimately won the battle. And there will be room then for providing more gas to Italy to keep their lights on. Let me briefly comment on the global market, because I think, again, this is widely misunderstood. There's a tendency, there was a rather, I think, naive article in the Financial Times a few days ago saying, oh, there's no gas shortage, there's enough gas in the world. But that's true, but the problem is that there are physical constraints. And I think two things are in this chart. Firstly, some numbers on the left-hand side. So these are freely available from I think it's the Institute of the IEA again. The main exporters, Australia, the Middle East, the US, and ASEAN countries like Malaysia, North Africa, which is important for Europe. And then the main importers are almost a different set of countries. Big importers in Europe, Japan, South Korea, China. The US being a big country, I think probably imports on one seaboard and exports on another. And then a little bit of importing in Spain, in Europe, of which Spain and UK particularly are large. France is also very large. But the point is that these are largely separate. That you've got exporters and you've got importers, and they really don't overlap. So what that then creates is a margin between export prices and import prices. And I think there's a very nice review by the Oxford Energy Institute here in the UK. It's the orange solid line, shows that this global market has suddenly become into substantial imbalance. Again, from sort of late 2021, as energy constraints began to emerge. And the prediction is that this could go even higher. They probably maybe reduced this a little since August, but the prediction is that over the winter of 2023, this margin could go even higher. And why does this margin exist? Because there isn't sufficient capacity. So this is the difference between the price in the US, the major exporter, and the price either in Europe or in Asia for the major importers. And once you run out of capacity, then those two prices can diverge. You can have the price that the importers are willing to pay becomes huge, and they're all competing with each other. It becomes hugely higher than the price that exporters would get in their own domestic markets. And over time, that will come down. It's the same basic economics point. We will build the capacity. We will build the regasification facilities, and over time these prices will come back into balance. Interesting, I understand that about 30% of global shipbuilding capacity, which is a lot of that's in South Korea, is now being devoted to creating floating gas terminals, which can be moored in the Baltic in particular. And that even this year that will substantially increase import capacity in Germany. But of course, the full impact will take of increased supply will take 2 to 3, maybe even 4 years. Nevzat, do you have another question?
Yeah, this is expectation for all.
So this is a forecast. So like any other forecast, it's uncertain. But what they've done is looked at the physical creation of capacity and try to understand what will the balance of supply and demand be in Asia and Europe, and gradually that will be eased by greater LNG imports. Again, it's only a forecast. A cold winter could push prices higher, make the margin even greater. A warm winter would have the opposite effect. So I think that's a key thing. So actually, I haven't got that much more to cover. Just draw the threads together. Higher prices. So demand will fall a fair bit. I mean, we don't just need policy action, the kind of management I'm talking about. But we're in a situation, because we've got these public subsidies coming in, energy companies are not going to be allowed to fail. And I'm aware of the support for EDF, for example, in France. So energy companies can bid for all the imports they need with the taxpayer covering the bill, but that's a big fiscal risk. But across Europe, the question then is, will demand and supply balance without either a sharp rise in prices, or if there's an unexpected shock, a weather shock, and ending up with such a shortage that we have to cut off gas to major industrial users. We have to stop, we don't have enough gas to use in electricity generation, and therefore we could end up with electricity blackouts, rolling electricity blackouts. And I think we need adult conversations about this. We need to be saying, this could happen, how will we deal with it? Germany's actually, I think, been quite impressive. They've shown that it is possible to reduce gas consumption in industry and public sector buildings, etc., by around 15%. But I think a lot more can be done in other countries. I think 15% is quite possible, and that that needs to be done in across all the major gas. The thing is, it's 15% reduction, especially in gas usage, but also in electricity consumption as well. So I think there's an obligation, even in France, which is a somewhat smaller user of gas, to still say, no, at peak times, if there's going to be a cold snap in Europe, we need to ensure that the electricity produced in France is still available, for example, for export to Germany or to the UK, or particularly to Italy. So conclusion, I'd say this has got I think we're barking up the wrong tree. In a sense, we're not paying enough attention to the possibility of, supply and demand, and the need to reduce this demand across through managed measures. The EU, I don't think, by the way, I would say the EU, we have some very fraught debates in Britain about our relationship with the EU. And I have to say, I'm something of an EU critic. I'm not somebody who's a fan of everything to do with and I think in this crisis, to me, the EU, and I don't mean Europe, I mean the EU, has not performed well. I think there's been a lot of somewhat irrelevant talk about coordinated EU-wide response, when what matters is the major five consumers. Does it really matter what happens in Hungary? Do we need Hungary on board? No, we don't. There's been a lot of attention to the long term, not the short term. We need to redesign our wholesale energy regime. But again, that's not really necessary, because the market will do that job for us. It will bring the LNG in globally. They're also discussing a very foolish wholesale price cap. Now, all that will do is make the situation worse, because yes, it may protect the government, but it will then further limit supply and make blackouts even more likely. The UK is also doing rather poorly, our politicians. For example, we're not talking about demand management at all. Germany have done much better. The UK is not talking about demand management at all. And we're actually considering signing long-term contracts at unfair, elevated price levels, which is effectively a form of borrowing. So the price caps are good, but they're only half the story. And we need to focus on shifting this demand curve back so that we're once again in a situation with balanced demand. So this is I didn't quite deal with the slide prepared, quite a slide as I should. So this is the concluding point. We need to focus, because of the supply shock, we need to focus on moving this demand back to D prime in order collectively to limit our exposure to price risks. It's a European problem, and it needs action, particularly by those five major countries. So it's France, the UK, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. And I think if those five countries act in consort, much of the weaponization of gas by Vladimir Putin will be nullified.
Impressive.
That's it.
It's a really it's impressive, and I learned a lot of things. But my main question before we conclude this, I don't want to forget about the main question in my mind. When we lower demand of the energy, does not going to affect development our economy? Will not?
Yes, look, it would be foolish to say that there's going to be no negative economic effects from the reduction in supply. But the question to me is, to what extent do you allow the price system to decide the allocation of that supply? And to what extent do you use managed demand or education? So, I'm not saying that we will end up with avoiding all problems, but I'd give one example, which is very prominent in the UK. We've suddenly got a very big rate of business failure. So we protected businesses during the pandemic, but things like hotels, bars, and restaurants, now many of them are now going into bankruptcy because of high energy prices. If we could actually bring energy prices down, and do more, we are providing some protection, but it's unclear. I think there'd be a lot more confidence if we had a very clear policy to say we're going to do a great deal to reduce prices going forward. That would then provide a lot of certainty and allow those businesses to get the credit to manage without so many having to close. Another second example, I'll stop at two. Which industries should consume gas and which should not? Some, and I'm thinking in areas like aluminium smelting, I think this is true of some forms of pharmaceuticals, heavily reliant on gas. But in addition, it's very costly to close and restart the facilities. So if they want to stop using gas, then it's that production capacity is likely to go to China and go to the Far East. So that there's a long-term impact on European manufacturing capacity. Whereas if we do managed demand, we can say, no, we're going to manage demand, but these are critical industries which we don't want to lose. We're not just going to rely on the price mechanism. We can make sure that they still get enough gas. They don't have to switch off those facilities. But it's detailed. You're actually talking about moving a step in the direction of a wartime managed economy, which is never going to be perfect. But we are in a war situation. That's why it's necessary.
And my second question, as far as I got from your presentation, we don't have supply problem in the world, but it seems we have management problem to match the demand and supply.
Yeah.
And I think one of the maybe the biggest mistake of Europe, relying on the Russian gas, and now, as you said, the Putin using as a gas weaponizer against Europe. And do you think how we can manage and how many years it will take to come not depending Russian gas? I mean, as a whole Europe.
I mean, you probably need to speak to specialists who have greater detailed knowledge. So my understanding of reading what those specialized energy economists are saying, that it's sort of 2 to 3 years to build up that import capacity in Europe and indeed extra export capacity in the US or in countries like, I've heard Indonesia is potentially a major exporter, but needs to build up that capacity, just to give one of many possible examples. So 2 to 3 years time, I think we could be virtually complete, at least for the most of Europe. I think Hungary, the countries of Eastern Europe, I think will still be reliant to an important degree on Russian gas. If we're looking at Poland, at Hungary, and Bulgaria, and those sort of countries. But for most of Europe, I think we can be completely independent of Russian gas in 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, well, and before I read your article that you published lately, and I was looking also to develop my knowledge on crisis of energy in Europe. And the latest article what I saw on The Economist seems OPEC does not answer the question of development countries supplying more. And do you think the impact of OPEC will affect more further the energy crisis in Europe?
I think it's a point I made briefly earlier, that the oil and oil derivatives products are a little bit separate from gas. We don't use oil much for electricity generation. I mean, it's clearly also related to the war in Ukraine. Higher oil prices is going to be beneficial for Putin. So in that sense, what the OPEC is doing is not particularly welcome from a Western point of view. And you know, politically, it can contribute overall to, you know, I think what is a difficult, the most obvious case in Europe, I think, will be the new government, new populist government in Italy, led by Giorgia Meloni. And you know, I think they've been a bit ambivalent on their attitudes, but they clearly are concerned about the impact of the war and high energy costs, which would include oil as well as gas, on Italian citizens. So there is I suppose this is what Putin is hoping for, is that the resolve of Western countries will weaken, and will somehow be saying to Ukraine, no, we're not going to give you more arms. You must go to the negotiating table and reach some sort of face-saving, you know, a deal which saves face for Putin. So it is relevant, but it's at one remove from the problems we've been talking about today.
Because we had the last 2 weeks, we have really a big the grave of the supply of the oil in France, and we have really it's difficult for the moment people in France to find the oil. Beside the energy crisis we have, and electric prices is going upper and upper, but it's, to me, before before I was thinking it's the same, the old energy, the problem. I was not saying that will be different between the oil and the gas and the coal, but now it's much more clear. And thank you so much for explain. And we have one question from the Nuri. Please, Nuri, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Professor, for the presentation. That was insightful. I have a question about one thing which I don't quite understand, because you mentioned that we need to increase import capabilities.
Yeah.
For unity in the European market. However, it has to do with infrastructure.
Yeah.
And to make infrastructure, you'll need the exact same thing that we have a problem with, namely resources. So how does that work? I didn't quite understand that part, actually.
I think it's a good question. I think you're pushing me a little bit on my own detailed knowledge, but the example of these floating gas terminals, which particularly being put into the Baltic, I think typically those might be manufactured in South Korea. So then they're ships which have the gas regasification facility built into them. So there may be an energy problem to some extent in South Korea that's pushing up the price. So the price of those facilities is certainly higher than one ideally would be paying. But I think the incentives are so strong now, it's become so profitable that's not holding back production.
Thank you.
And my last question, we have heard that Putin and Erdogan has a meeting in the meeting in Kazakhstan. And on the news, we have seen Russia try to make Turkey as a hub for the gas and energy transmission to Europe. What do you think about it? Is it possible? And it can work?
I think the diagram which I've showed, will give an idea of, yes, it will have some effects, but it's curious. It sounds to me more like public relations and Putin trying to sound like he's, in charge of the situation when he's possibly not really got a total grip. Perhaps that would be useful over the longer term, particularly for countries of Southwest Europe. I can imagine that might be beneficial to Italy. It would give an extra source of supply, an extra way for Italy to get gas. But I don't think it's a short. It will take time anyway, so I can't think it's terribly relevant in the longer term. And it's ultimately assuming that there's no longer hostility and between Russia and the West. Otherwise, it can't be terribly relevant. I mean, possibly Putin is thinking he can smuggle his gas to Turkey and it will appear in Europe as Turkish gas rather than Russian gas. So that could be beneficial to him. But again, it's going to take years for that to really make a material impact.
My latest question maybe is not related to your research area, but as I am sociologist, I would like to ask you your opinion. If really, as you presented, if it does not match the supply and demand, the management, and as the European Union is too much on bureaucracy and heavy management issue with European Union, which we have been seeing critical point from Italy, Hungary, Poland, and in fact, as well as from France. Do you think it will create these energy prices will affect economy and economy affect the social problems?
Undoubtedly, there will be, and I think it's so. I'm more knowledgeable on the situation here in Britain, and we're a very unequal society. We have regrettably far too many poor households who struggle to find enough money to pay for food, and for heating, and their situation is, yet there the government has been reacting. They've been trying to put additional social support, but it's very hard to get that support sufficiently to everyone who needs it. So clearly there will be a lot of social pressures, and I think the UK is far from alone in that. Again, I don't want to try and say that there are easy solutions, but I am saying that relying on the market alone is wrong, is a mistake, is a major mistake. And when it comes to public sector intervention, in order to try and prevent blackouts, rationing, to try and reduce the prices as far as we can, that needs a sustained effort and a lot of discussion. And I think I'd say leave it to finish where we started off. I think it's less leaving it to the politicians and sound bites, and more saying, look, we have a lot of expertise in the industry amongst economists, amongst other commentators. Let's have adult discussion about how we can best manage the situation.
Thank you so much for your great presentation. We have really learned a lot of things, and now we have hope. We have no problem with the supply, but we have problem of the management. And it seems the politician really has to work more and smart way to find alternative as soon as possible. We don't have the social problem. It seems every country in Europe struggle precisely who demand on Russian gas. And yesterday it was one of the biggest manifestation in France. And thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you, and thank you for joining us.
My pleasure too.
Thank you.